Okay, we are going to make a start. So first of all, it is my great pleasure as General Secretary of the General Federation of Trade Unions to invite you to this evening's session, the first in our brand new this year's series on trade union and working class history. And for the first time, the Federation is collaborating with two libraries, the Marx Memorial Library in London and the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, in order to put on this monthly series of sessions on trade union and working class history. We've got 10 online sessions throughout the year on a whole range of topics, taking us through key events throughout trade union and working class history. And we're really pleased to say this year we've got two in-person sessions as well. The first will be towards the end of this year at the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, and the second of the in-person sessions will be next year in the spring in the Marx Memorial Library. So really excited to be expanding this series from the online into the real world. We hope that you'll be able to join us for those. It's great to see so many people. Just looking at the chat there, so many people from across the country joining us, but also from different unions. So you are all very, very welcome. I think this series is particularly important to us because we have a sincere belief that it is impossible for us to plan where we go as a movement, to understand the challenges we face now and to plot our course for the future if we don't really understand the history of our movement. And where better to start than with the 1842 strike that Katrina's going to be talking about today. So I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Professor Katrina Navickas. She's Professor of History at the University of Hartford and Director of the university's Heritage Hub. Her research focuses on the history of protest, social and political movements, contested public spaces in England from the 18th century to the present day. She has a number of publications out, including on loyalism and radicalism in Lancashire from 1798 to 1815, protest and the politics of space and place, 1789 to 1848. And most recently, I think published last year, Katrina, edited with Linda Ross, Matthew Kelly and Ben Anderson, New Lives, New Landscapes on Rural Modernity in Britain. Katrina, it's fantastic to have you with us today to kick off this series. And I think without further ado, it's over to you. Katrina's going to talk for the first part of the session, and then we will be opening up to questions, to discussion. So if you've got questions that you would like to ask of Katrina, at the bottom of the screen, you'll find a Q&A box. Feel free to put questions in there while Katrina's talking at the end of the talk, and we'll take as many of those as we can in the second part of the meeting. So Katrina, thanks so much for joining us for this very first session in the series, and over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Gwen, and thanks to everyone for coming on this unusually warm day here down south. Thanks also for the introduction. So I'm not going to speak for too long because I know it's an evening session, but just to introduce myself a bit more, I've got a new book coming out, hopefully next year. So if this is a bit of a taste of the sort of things I do, I've got a whole general history of protest in public space, which is coming out with reaction books sometime next year. So keep an eye out for that. I will be plugging it again, probably through the GFTU. So I'm going to share my screen now. And so this is an introduction really to trade unionism in the early 19th century, with the 1842 general strike as the focal point for thinking about how trade unionism developed, where it came from, and whether or not 1842 was a pivotal point in British history, and not just in terms of labour history, but also in the history of protest, social movements, policing, and government legislation. So there's lots of things to think about. But I'll start really with, I'll be talking about the trade union and political context for the strike, a bit on historical interpretations where historians have thought about how to frame what went on in 1842. We'll look at some of the key events of that summer, the state response, and some of the legacies. And there's been some interesting commemorative work done by trades councils, particularly in West Yorkshire, about what happened in Halifax. So where do we start? We start with quite an amorphous trades movement where in the 18th century trades unions don't exist in the modern form, although they do exist in various societies and associations. The more professional ones are in guilds, but with the growing textile and mining industries and manufacturing industries that we now term the Industrial Revolution in the later 18th century, trades do form combinations, individual societies. The first specifically named ones are in the later 18th century. We've got banners from the early 19th century. So the Tin Plate Workers Society, that banner that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen from the People's History Museum, is one of the earliest banners that they hold. And the important thing to note about early trade unionism is that it's incredibly skill specific. The emphasis is on the individual type of work and the type of trade. So trades are organized locally and regionally through societies, but they are not organized cross trades. They are very much in their specific lanes of what they do, be they tin plate workers or ladies shoemakers or blade makers in Sheffield. They are very specifically organised. So there's no overarching organisation that unites any of these particular trades groups. There are lots of other ways in which workers are organised. So they might be organised in friendly societies, which are much more charitable insurance type groups who explicitly avow to be apolitical and not involved in any type of negotiation tactics. They're very much solidarity type groups or philanthropy type groups. There are guilds, obviously, for the more professional classes, and livery societies for much more established trades. But again, those tend to be of employers and owners of businesses rather than the employees. So it's quite a mixed picture, but it's not as empty of organisation as earlier historians and earlier members of the labour movement have depicted, when, as we'll see, earlier trades union histories tend to portray the 18th century as a bit of a dark age in terms of organisation. Actually, we know of quite a lot of individual groups who are negotiating with their employers. There are obviously other types of trade union action. So machine breaking and much more forceful physical action is also a tactic that goes alongside peaceful negotiation. So we know the most famous, obviously, are the Luddites of 1812, who break textile machinery in the Midlands and north of England. But there's a longer history of types of direct action. We know of Luddite type action in the 1770s in the Midlands. So I also want to stress that this is important context for 1842, in that direct action still goes hand in hand with organised committees and employer-employee negotiation in the early 19th century. They're not always seen as oppositional. Sometimes they're seen as complementary, that you need that threat of force, whether you're going to break a machinery or you're going to set fire to an employee's haystack or barn. In the agricultural context, the two go hand in hand quite often, and we see that in 1842. Right, so there is some contemporary language that's used at the time, which goes out of favour a bit later, but you might see in the sources for this period. So trade unions are known as combinations because they are workers combining to claim on the employer for higher wages or for better conditions. So trade combinations is the usual term rather than unions in the early 19th century. Turnouts are people who go out on strike, quite often because they turn people out of their place of employment, so be it the mine or the factory. And we see that becomes a very common term, both used by strikers themselves, but also by the authorities in 1842. And blacklegs, which is a derogatory term for strike breakers or people who were employed by employers to replace workers on strike. So it is a derogatory term, but that's the term they quite commonly use. There are regional variations. So some trade union context from where we get to in 1842. The government is so concerned by the amount of combination, action and agitation in the middle of the French wars that they pass legislation banning collective bargaining in 1799 and 1800, known as the Combination Acts. There's various ones depending whether you're in England or Scotland, but essentially they're the main acts that employers can use to call on magistrates to prosecute their employees for striking or even daring to just turn up and ask for higher wages at the employer's door. So we do have plenty of records of cases, some of which go all the way up to the Treasury solicitors, the government. So the primary source extract that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen is from the Treasury solicitor papers in the National Archives, prosecuting the Society of Journeyman Ladies Shoemakers. And again, you can see how specific trades are and trade societies are in that period under the Combination Acts for daring to combine to ask for higher wages. There is also legislation against frame breaking, i.e. Luddism, in 1812, mainly specifically aimed at the Nottinghamshire frame weavers who weave stockings. But it's used quite severely against Luddites, leads to several trials that lead to executions and transportation. So there is a fear both amongst employers and amongst the government, which tends to be a Tory government in this period, against the growing threat, as they see it, of trades combining. And it's all in this atmosphere of revolution on the continent, particularly in France, but across Europe, and also in the New World, in Haiti and the West Indies, and across the empire, that the fear of the mob, the fear of the working class is seen as both an economic and a political issue. It affects the national economy, particularly during wartime. The government don't want large groups of workers striking or asking for higher wages when they're facing quite high national debt caused by the war. Particularly after the war ends in 1815, that again is an issue. And so in 1823, the Master and Servant Act criminalises breach of contract by employees. So if you leave your work because you're unhappy with the way your employer treats you, you can be sued by the employer for breach of contract. And that various versions of that legislation continue throughout the 19th century and are used to prosecute thousands of workers individually for breaking their contract. But when trading and the economy eases in the mid 1820s, once the wartime economy winds down and Britain is able to increase its imperial trade, the Combination Acts are repealed in 1825. Now, again, I'll stress that this doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all for trade unions, but it does mean that combinations can start to form, and it's from the 1820s onwards that we see much larger unions forming and the start of what we now regard as modern trade unions that are much more national and less specifically local or regional. So there is a bit more of a leeway, although I will stress again that employers are still very keen to prosecute against anyone who's seen as combining. And we see that from the 1820s onwards, there's increasing attempts by various types of groups, both political and trades groups, to create cross-trades unions, and increasingly some idea of a national trade union congress or type of consolidated union. So John Gast, who's a Deptford shipwright, proposes a union of the useful classes in 1822. The Metropolitan Trades Unions formed in London in 1831, which attempts to coordinate action in London, which we mustn't forget that London is the largest centre of population, that despite the rapid rise of the industrial cities across the UK, London still has the largest number of different trades and very high levels of activism. The Owenite Grand National Consolidated Trade Union is attempted in 1832 to 34. It's not a particularly big success, but it is one of the attempts by the Owenite socialist movement to, again, combine these quite disparate trades together. And it crystallizes with the Dorchester labourers case in 1834, what we now know as the Tolpuddle martyrs, who were transported to Tasmania for trying to combine and join the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. So that kind of sheds light, and particularly national knowledge of the attempts to form much more national structure of trades congress or union across Britain. So again, where does the idea of a general strike come from? Again, it's not a new idea. Earlier movements like the Luddites had attempted to motivate people to come out on strike all at once. Perhaps the genesis of the idea that sparks 1842 is in this pamphlet by the radical William Benbow, who proposes the Grand National Holiday, or the Congress of the Productive, and it should be actually the Congress of the Productive Classes in 1832. And it's quite a best-selling pamphlet, this. You can access it on Google Books if you want a thrilling read. But it's important for two reasons. Benbow was a bookseller. He had his shop on Fleet Street in London. And he first proposed that the producers of wealth, the productive classes, should pause for a whole month, what he called national holiday. And that would do two things. One, it would prove to the employers that the productive classes were absolutely necessary for the national economy. If they stop work, then what else could we do? But also it would allow time for the working classes to form a national congress, who would be able to debate both economic and political issues, and challenge the political system, which was at that time widely sort of debated as creating an unrepresentative system. Remember, this is the time when hardly any working class men have the vote. But Benbow was also a forceful militant, so he also proposed militant action, that if the government and the employers wouldn't agree to this Congress and to political as well as the economic change, he did essentially advocate armed action. But there was also interesting bits in the pamphlet which again had longer legacies, like the strikers would draw on parish funds to sustain themselves during the strike. This is in the eras of the development of the new poor law as well, so it's questioning this new welfare system coming in. They will also elect local committees to distribute food and relief and keep order during this time as well. So there's some interesting ideas in the pamphlet. Obviously, it didn't happen. It's in the midst of the agitation for the First Reform Act, which extended the franchise essentially just to the middle classes. But it did form that kernel of interest in this idea of a national strike, which the Chartists would later take on, as well as the later trades organisations. So I'm not going to talk too much about what historians think. There's plenty of pamphlets and books about the general strike, but what happens in 1842 has been debated with different interpretations. And one of the main questions is, should it be called a general strike or not? So earlier interpretations, particularly Marxist interpretations by Eric Hobsbawm or John Foster, asserted that the scope of the strike was large enough for it to be deemed the first general strike in Britain. There were enough trades involved. Geographically, it was large enough. So it's estimated about 500,000 workers took part from across the UK, from Dorset all the way up to lowland Scotland. So we can call it a national strike in the British sense, and it does cover colliers and all types of machine workers, textile workers, and I'll go into some detail about the different types of trades involved, but it is a cross-trade national strike. Later historians were more cautious in terming it that, so F.C. Mather and Malcolm Chase argued perhaps the label wasn't appropriate enough. It was too much of a 20th century label, that the strike wasn't nationally coordinated enough for it to be called a general strike, and it had variable support amongst different types of workers. Now, my position is probably somewhere in between. I think you don't have to have full support for it to be called general strike, and I do think it was national enough, but it wasn't as perhaps revolutionary as perhaps earlier Marxist historians would have liked. But I do recommend reading Malcolm Chase's book Early Trade Unionism, if you want more information on what actually happened and the early trades movements. There's affordable copies published by Breviary Stuff Publications. Okay, so finally, the kind of political context is important, and it's something that sometimes gets forgotten in more standard labour histories of the strike, is that this is the era of Chartism, the biggest working class movement for the vote in the 19th century. I'm a Chartist by political persuasion, in many means, so I love the Chartists. So feel free to criticise them, but I will defend them. This is 1842 is the second national petition. They sent 3 national petitions to Parliament asking for universal manhood suffrage and for a change in the political system more generally, the 6 points. So 1842 is a climactic year for them. It is the largest national petition that they send. I think it's about 6 million signatures. Whatever the debate about the actual total, they did mobilize millions of people in 1842 to demand the vote. And we'll see how that goes alongside the activities of the trades at this time, sometimes coalescing, sometimes in tension. But this is a period of great political agitation, ideas about democracy, ideas about working class people having agency, having power, the power of the crowd is all there. So the illustration is from Punch, and it's the second national petition being forced into Parliament. It was too large to get through the doors of Westminster Palace, and they did break some of the door to get it in. And because it was such a large roll, we're talking millions of signatures all sort of stitched up together in one big roll. So it was huge. So there is a lot of political pressure, and there is also middle-class political agitation in the form of the Anti-Corn Law League. Now, anyone who's of a certain age who studied 19th century history will know about the Corn Laws. It's quite boring, but the Anti-Corn Law League are demanding free trade. They generally are the employers, the liberal middle classes, the Guardian readers, who are demanding a kind of freer economic system, which is in opposition to a lot of what the trades want. Although the trades want cheaper bread, they also don't want an Adam Smith free trade economics, which would pull down their wages. So the Anti-Corn Law League are the enemy in many respects here, and many of the employers who employ the people who then go out on strike are quite influential members of the Anti-Corn Law League. The Corn Laws are repealed 4 years later in 1846, but there is that agitation going on as well. So this is this era of, that's why I love the 1840s. Everything's going off in the 1840s. It is also an era of economic depression. So in 1841, there's quite a severe economic slump, particularly in the textile industry and the cotton industry. And the employers respond with severe wage cuts. And we're talking 25%, 30% wage cuts in 1841. But the first people to go out on strike are the coal miners in the East Midlands and West Midlands, so the Staffordshire coal mines. The colliers in Staffordshire walk out in the summer of 1842 over wage cuts, also bad employment practices like truck payments and various other restrictions on their employment. The southeast Lancashire textile workers turn out again over a wage cut of about 25% in July 1842. So there's already various independent actions by regional groups of trade societies and associations, which build to a much larger action that we know as the general strike. So here again, the Chartists come in, and there is debate again in the historical debate about what role did the Chartist political leadership play in the organisation of mass turnouts and spreading the strike. They organised mass meetings in 1842. and start to talk about using the general strike or striking to push for the passage of the national petition, the 6 points, and pressurise the government to giving working class men the vote. And this is where the tension lies. And we'll see how the simultaneous action by both the trades and the Chartists, but not all the trades agree that this is the best strategy. And not all Chartists agree that this is the best strategy to get government to pass the vote by getting everyone out on strike. So there are lots of debates and divisions, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of people either getting involved in Chartist agitation or in strike action. So on the 3rd of August 1842, 10,000 colliers in Airdrie, Lanarkshire in Scotland walk out, and things snowball from them. And again, what role did perhaps the Chartists play in this? They're reporting this in their press. The working class literacy is quite high, despite impressions. People are reading the papers. The trades have got their own papers. So there is a lot of cross-reporting of actions, and obviously that inspires people. There are itinerant lecturers going around, both Chartist and trades lecturers, going around sort of spreading the news. We've got fast stagecoaches. We've just about got trains, enabling people to move quite quickly. And there's mass meetings at the beginning of August across the north west, particularly Ashton, Stalybridge, in what we now know as Tameside, who are both Chartist and trades, and they decide, particularly in Ashton and Stalybridge, to strike for the charter, try and get the 1842 petition passed by going out on strike. And what we see is spread through turnouts coming out of a particular factory or a mine, and then marching from factory to factory or from mine to mine across the coal field or across a valley, say in the Calder Valley, and physically taking people out on strike. The 1842 strikes are quite often known as the plug strikes. Actually, I think this is sort of a representation of that. They're known as the plug strikes because the way that the workers pulled people out on strike is they pulled the plugs out of the boilers of the steam engines. Both in the textile mills and in the mines, you simply pull out the plug. The boiler ceases to work, they hide the plug, and that forces people out on strike. It is a form of Luddism, but it's not specifically destroying the machinery. They don't destroy the boilers, they just pull the plugs out. And again, this is a kind of symbolic action as well as a physical action, that they want to regain control over those working conditions by controlling when the boilers come on and off. So that's why you also see this term, the plug riots or the plug strikes, because they're pulling out the plugs. The other defining feature of this action is this moving from place to place. It's not quite flying pickets yet because they're not necessarily picketing each place, although there is retaliation against the blacklegs, the strike breakers. There is physical violence, as there always is. There's a lot of intimidation. But this is the fight that these workers feel that they need to do. So in some senses, it's much more peaceful than Luddism, but in others, it bears those kind of characteristics of using both organisation, as I said before, these committees alongside physical force. And actually they call the organisations, these meetings, I've got a poster of one there, committees of public safety. They are looking at the revolutionary contexts over in France, the legacy of the French Revolution, So these committees of public safety coordinate this action. So, okay, this group will go over there, this group will go over there. So there's particular nodes of action. So Bury in Lancashire is one. I saw someone's from Bury here. I'm from Rochdale, so I don't know if that's rivalry or not. And their delegates headed northwards up into, I guess, Bacup, Rosendale, that area. Staley Bridge was another key centre there. Then their networks headed southeast into, I guess, the Peak District. Todmorden headed eastwards across the Pennines to take out the woolen workers, and Stockport was also a key centre and moved southwards into Cheshire. And these routes reflected the travel networks of these workers and also the patterns of industrialisation. And we see similar nodes of action in the south of Scotland and elsewhere in the Midlands and across Britain. So there is a kind of a nascent organisation that works pretty well in spreading the strike over the weeks of the first 2 weeks of August 1842. But there's the government and local authorities act pretty swiftly and pretty drastically. They do fear revolution. They do fear direct action. There is military retaliation, most famously, I guess, and most memorialised in Preston in Lancashire on the 12th of August. The local militia and troops fire on an unarmed crowd, killing 4. And dozens were seriously wounded. And there is a memorial in front of the old Corn Exchange, is now pub, in Preston. The government issues a royal proclamation on the 13th of August, which is then issued locally by magistrates. So this is a poster from Bolton, I think, basically saying if anyone turns out or anyone is involved in disturbances, they will be punished. This doesn't necessarily put down agitation immediately, but it is quite clear that the government and local authorities are trying to put down these strikes by force, first of all, rather than by negotiation. The government orders quite a lot of troops up north using the new train system. So troops are stationed up north. So I think this is a fascinating map. This is is in the National Archives and the Home Office papers. The Commissioner of Police in Manchester sets up basically kind of like sort of police posts across Greater Manchester on the turnpike toll sort of booths with police and special constables and messengers, so that they were expecting different sections of trades to come in from across the industrial districts surrounding Manchester, and they would be prior warned and send troops out to stop them on the roads in, which is what happened. So there was a new military commander of the Northern District called General Weems or Wemyss. He first faced an Ashton march coming into Manchester and snowballing in size as it approached on the 9th of August 1842. The Ashton strikers wanted to go directly to negotiate with the manufacturers in the commercial exchange. And Sir Charles Shaw, the Commissioner of Police, and the General Weems brought out the troops and blockaded the streets, stopping them coming in from the Ashton roads. Interestingly, the magistrate had a different idea, Mr. Maud. He was concerned that blockading the entrance to Manchester would inevitably cause the strikers to fight back. He wanted the strikers to peacefully march through Manchester in a kind of controlled protest march to let off steam. He tried to divert. He negotiated with Shaw and Weems, and eventually they were allowed, after tense negotiations, to march through the city centre, avoiding the exchange, but ending up at Granby Row Fields, which I think I've got. Oh, that's sort of trouble in Salford. There's always trouble in Salford. Granby Row Fields, which is now kind of part of kind of Manchester Met Unis. And there was a large meeting which was addressed by Chartists. So there is a kind of coalescence of the Chartists, particularly in Manchester. The Chartist National Convention was being held at the same time in Manchester at the Carpenters' Hall. And it's essentially National Conference of the Chartists with delegates from across the country, was holding their conference on the 15th and 16th of August at the same time as the trades were holding their own conference just down the road in the pub. And there are votes on whether they should vote for the charter. But importantly, these aren't two separate groups of people. Some of the trade union leaders are also Chartist leaders. In Manchester, my favourite pair, the brothers Daniel and Maurice Donovan, who were Irish immigrants, who were president and secretary of the Powerloom Weavers Union, so who were organising quite substantial numbers of Powerloom cotton weavers in the big mills in Manchester. They were also the delegates to the Chartist Convention. I don't know exactly how if they kept going in between both venues. They weren't that far apart, so I suspect they may have spent the morning in one and the afternoon in the other. But they were both sort of dipping in and out and pushing the Trades Congress, as it essentially was, to vote for the charter. Alexander Hutchinson, who was representing the wire drawers and card makers union, he was elected to the chair of the Chartist Convention. So there is cooperation and attempts to coordinate the action. 143 accredited delegates were present at the Trades Congress. There were attempts by some of the unions to separate the wage demands from the vote for the charter. So of the 85 delegates who we know spoke at the Trades Congress, 58 said they were for the charter, for striking until the government gave people the vote. 7 argued that the strike should just be about wages and nothing else. 19 had been instructed by their branches to abide by the decision of whatever Congress decided, which is a nice get out, I think. And 1 had no mandate. The Chartist leadership, particularly Fergus O'Connor, the great Irish agitator, were suspicious of this tactic of the trades combining and striking for the charter. So again, even the Chartist leadership weren't sure about whether this was a good strategy or not. There was a suspicion, particularly amongst O'Connor and his allies, that the Anti-Corn Law League had set the strike up in order to discredit the Chartists, that they'd kind of forced their workers out on strike to associate them with the Chartists. But eventually the Chartists agreed that it would be a good tactic and that it supported the strike. And it's from that point onwards, the 16th of August, which is also the anniversary of Peterloo in Manchester, that the strike effectively spread nationally, so reached places like Dorset. There was a big strike in Norwich. Southern Scotland again came out. The other sort of pinpointed action was in Calderdale in the West Riding, heart of the wool and textile industry, and was dramatised by the Illustrated London News. This is where these illustrations are from. There's not quite any photographs yet. We don't get any daguerreotypes until 1848. So we're reliant on these artists' impressions. So again, we take them with a pinch of salt, but it's all we've got. On the 15th of August, Halifax strikers met on Skircutt Moor and marched 4 miles along the valley. And the march snowballed as it was met by groups from other places. So it was met with people from Hebden Bridge and Sowerby Bridge and Todmorden. Woolen weavers from Bradford joined them. And most importantly, strikers from Oldham and Rochdale joined them. They'd marched over the Pennines, over the tops, over Blackstone Edge all night to reach the workers in Halifax. And it's estimated about 5,000 entered Halifax on the 15th to 16th of August. They reached the North Bridge, which is what this is depicting, and the military had drawn a line across the bridge and trying to stop them from getting into the centre of Halifax. The magistrates read the Riot Act and declared that these groups couldn't enter the town. And it's almost like a kind of invading army with a kind of besieged town. Prisoners were taken and the crowd regrouped back on Skircutt Moor, which is a traditional working class meeting site. You know, there'd been post Peterloo meetings there and so forth. On the 16th of August, the prisoners were sent to Elland railway station to travel on to Wakefield jail, where they'd be processed and tried. And the Illustrated London News also illustrates the rescue attempt, which is important because it shows the level of community support for the strike. So the soldiers who were accompanying the stagecoach wagon to the station, when they returned, they delivered the prisoners and were returning back. They were stoned from above, from the houses above. It's a very hilly area, by women and children, as well as by other members of the community. And there were quite ugly confrontations there at Salterhebble. The Yorkshire authorities and the manufacturers blamed Lancastrians, typically. The Halifax Guardian newspaper pointed out that it was Lancashire women who were could be identified by their accents, the women were extremely excited. We heard several urging the men to rescue the prisoners who'd been taken in the morning. One explained, and I don't know what accent to use, probably my accent, if I were a man, they shouldn't have been long there. Another said, you're soft if you don't fetch them out tonight. So there is a sense of that this is a community supported strike, that the community are helping the strikers once they're out and they're not being paid. Malcolm Chase noted the dire situation of the strikers during this period of economic depression. For example, a carpet weaver involved at Salterhebble disturbances, a man called Charles Greenwood, spent the night after he'd run away from this confrontation, spent the night hiding in a drain. And when he returned home, he found that his son had died from starvation because of the dire situation that these workers had been in. So it was kind of a desperate situation for most, but there were kind of political as well as more knowledgeable economic reasons why the strikers went out on strike, as well as just the kind of organised reaction to the large wage cuts of that year. Another example of kind of community kind of cohesion, if you like, around these strikes is that there is evidence that the black legs or the black sheeps were kind of intimidated, were treated badly. So this is an example from a witness at the assizes of the trials of the workers who were arrested afterwards. So Sarah Boothroyd, a turnout from Mr. Woods, mentioned that a couple of people worked after the turnout and they got called black sheep. But the Boothroyd and her comrades have been turned out 20 weeks, but they're supported by the union. I get 4 shillings a week. Some of the men get 8 shillings a week. So there is a system of strike pay as well to keep the strike going. but this is a desperate economic situation, and eventually the strike peters out, partly because of this severe reaction by the authorities and partly just financially. People just have to go back to work. There isn't the financial support, both from the unions and also from the Chartists, to support them. Over 1,500 people were arrested in the northwest of England during the strike. 150 were sentenced at Yorkshire Assizes for various offences, mainly for public order offences. It's much easier to convict someone for breaking the Riot Act than it is for combination still. But essentially, the agitation ends in September 1842. But it does have a larger legacy. So again, this is just shorthand. I'm not going to go through all the rest of the history of trade unionism. I'm sure the rest of the course that you'll attend will take you through this. But there is trade union history is a pattern of setbacks, fights, some leniency, and then some retractions. You know, history sometimes goes backwards as well as forwards, but we keep fighting. The idea of a national trade union congress is pretty much settled after 1842. There is seen to be a need for it. So the first national trade union congress is held in Manchester in 1868. 1871, the Trade Union Act legalizes trade unions. But again, there's backwards and forwards between different governments and different periods of trade union history, which are more difficult than others, which again you can read about and learn about in later sessions. But the 1842 general strike was crucially important. It did show that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of workers could go out at the same time and be fairly organised, show solidarity across trades that had generally not worked that closely together, or had been in parallel rather than in unity. It also showed that there was a political element to the agitation, that at least a majority of those workers and certainly Chartist supporters realised that there needed to be political solutions to economic distress, i.e. getting working class people into Parliament to change the laws and to fight the dominant free trade, free market ideology that led to these wage cuts and to employers creating these conditions in the first place, and a general sort of recognition that trade unions were a permanent part of working class organisation. It's really important. And so I'm always wary of people concluding that events fail. They might fail in the short term, but they always have consequences. They always have a legacy. They always have lessons to learn. This was a crucial period of training for a lot of working class leaders, be it in political leadership or in public speaking or in trade union organising. So, and they did get people out. They did organise a system, quite organised system of relief and strike payments. And they did work out, you know, how to really mobilise the working classes in 1842. So for those reasons, I do think it was a success, because it did create an environment and a learning environment for later agitations. So I'll just finish that we still remember the 1842 strike. So Calderdale Trades Council have done quite a lot of work on 1842 in collaboration with local communities, local trades unions and branches, and really sort of thought about what it means to commemorate it in a local context. So you can read all about that there. I've also been asked by Dan of the Calderdale Trades Council to promote their film called Bread Not Bayonets. There's a YouTube link, just search for Bread Not Bayonets on YouTube. and you can see the commemoration that they did in 2022 and what it means to local people to remember that strike, and also what it means for local identity, but also that it's not just a local event, it has much bigger significance for the trades movement across the country. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.